Hello and welcome to West Country Wanderings. Welcome to another one in my Secrets of the Stroudwater series. Today we're going to be looking at a feature on the Stroudwater Canal itself. Now if you're a regular viewer to these updates here and also on my Secrets series, you'll probably be familiar with what is behind me there. That is Westfield Lock, or now known as John Robinson Lock, where there's been lots of activity with the volunteers, the Cotswold Canals Trust and the WRG as well, uncovering that lock and making it good to go as they start the progress on the missing mile. But that's not what I'm here to talk about today. If you remember at the end of the last update, 15A, I finished at a place called Dock Lock, which is just behind the camera. And it's a secret about this location that I want to tell you about today here on West Country Wanderings. Now before I go into detail about the history and the secrets of what lay behind me, I need to tell you a little bit about the geography of this location, because it is a little bit complex. That strip of land there, where you can see a nice bit of green lawn there, that is known as the island. And you're probably thinking, well, why is it an island? Well, it was made an island when the Stroudwater Canal arrived this part of Eastington around about 1778, so parts of it were opened around 1774. 1778 it arrived here, and when it cut through this section of land, it made that bit there an island because of the Oldbury Brook, which lies on the other side of it, parallel to the road, what was in front of the then Wheatonhurst workhouse. It's no longer a workhouse. I think it's now like a residential home for children, but I think it's now called William Morris House, but it was then a workhouse. And because you had the Oldbury Brook on that side and the canal in front of it, it was, in fact, an island. Now, just to give you a little bit more clarity about this particular location, as I say, I'll insert a map now, an old one and the present day OS map, so you can compare the two. The first thing to note is that the Oldbury Brook has been rerouted many times, and the reason for that is because of three main mills in this area. One of them just lies over here. You can often hear working on there. I'll insert a photograph of that now, because that's an important part of our secret story here at Dock Lock. Now this here there's like a bund here you probably see, and the Oldbury Brook runs at a lower level than the canal. Now there was an aqueduct, the Oldbury Aqueduct, which meant that the Oldbury Brook went underneath the canal at this point. Now that will have to be restructured and remade good again when the canal connects up, when it's done for the missing mile in this particular section here. But yes, we've got a mill over there and two more further on close in the heart of Eastington. The lock here is one of a flight of 5 locks from this location here. The first one being Westfield Lock, now known as John Robinson Lock, of course, and then we go through Dock Lock, but it wasn't called Dock Lock originally. It was renamed early 1820s because of the aforementioned dry dock. It was originally called Court Orchard Lock. Now I can only guess why it was called that. There was lots of extensive orchards in this area around the village of Eastington. In fact, there is a really nice community orchard. If you go down this footpath here across the main road going into the village, there's a lovely orchard there. So I can imagine that there were orchards all dotted around here. Court, well, I'm not entirely sure, but because it was Wheatonhurst workhouse, it probably had links to Whitminster Court, which lies about a mile in that direction. Now, not related to canals at all, but there is a lovely seat right here at this location between Westfield Lock, John Robinson Lock, and Dock Lock, and it's dedicated to a gentleman called Michael Lorp, 1933 to 2020, and he was actually the founder of William Morris House, which is part of the Camphill Community, and they look after children with special needs, learning disabilities and the like. And I'll put a link to the description of the Camphill Community, because there's another one the other side of Eastington. In fact, they're dotted all around the country, so if you're interested about that, have a look at their website, because they do brilliant work. But that is now what was in the original Wheatonhurst workhouse. Anyway, our story goes on now, so we're going to head towards Dock Lock so I can tell you what happened here. Now behind me here you'll be able to make out a green strip of land, and as I say, when the canal arrived here in 1778, there was nothing there basically. You just had the old brick on the other side, you had the workhouse there and the canal, nothing else in this area apart from the mills. Now it was because of two things that the company of proprietors decided to build a dry dock at this location. One of those is to have a coal wharf. There was a huge requirement for the lots of the mills in the Stroud valleys to have coal. Originally it came in up and down the River Severn at Framalode, and then it was moved by horse and cart into the Stroud valleys to power those steam engines which generated the power to drive the machinery inside all of those mills. And you had three big ones in this area. Later on they were actually owned by a gentleman called Mr. Hicks, who will come up again in our story. So you had that, and they decided later on, so after about 40 odd years of the canal being here, they needed a facility here for a wharf. But they also needed a blacksmith shop because of the equipment on the canal, like the lock gates, hinges, that sort of thing. They needed repairing and replacing, so they needed a facility for that. And they also needed a facility for other equipment. Two of the main pieces of equipment was an icebreaker. Yes, I know that sounds rather strange these days, but we had much colder winters then, and they needed an icebreaker to break the ice up on the Stroudwater Canal so you could get those Severn trows through it and into Stroud, and then connecting up with the Thames and Severn Canal. The other thing which I read from my notes in Joan Tucker's book is something called a muddling machine. I'm not sure that's a misspelling, but I would imagine it's some kind of dredging apparatus, because one of the other things that canals always need, and still do, is some method by getting dredging to take place to keep the canal clear of silt and leave it enough draft there to get those Severn trows through. Now, incredibly, one of the buildings survives from the days that the dry dock was here, and it's this one here. Now, I don't think this was actually the covering for the dry dock itself, more about which in a minute, because that was a really interesting building from the descriptions I read about it from the Stroudwater archives. But it's this one, which may have been used for actually storing coal for the wharf. And it needed to be quite secure, both from the road and from the canal, because theft was very, very common of coal. It was a very, very precious resource. So it's really good to see that still standing here. Now, behind me here, you'll be able to make out Docklock House. Now, that was built after, and I'll come on to Docklock House in a minute. But when Docklock opened, there was a requirement to have a lock keeper here, and he actually lived on the island. I'm not entirely sure well, probably in a cottage that's long since been demolished, but he looked after this one here, the lock, which was Court Orchard, just before the dock was completed, of course, Westfield Lock, also Pike Lock, Blunder Lock, and Newton Lock. So that was the 5 locks that made up the series. So his responsibility was quite a bit, because it is a bit of a stretch, probably about 3/4 of a mile to get down to Newton Lock, which is heading towards the direction of Stonehouse. So that was one of his responsibilities. Well, one of the strange bits of terminology I came across when looking in the records to research this particular video, Secrets of the Stroudwater, was a word called divers. And I was thinking, did they actually employ divers? But digging around, it turns out that word actually refers to not divers, but diverts. And it was because of the Albury Brook being diverted to more of the south region, to what its original course was, mainly to fill the needs of Meadow Mill, which is the one that lies quite close to Westfield Stroke John Robinson Lock. And often in the archive they're referring to the diverts, and they meaning the new stretch, or what was then the new stretch of water in the end of the 18th, early 19th century. Now, in terms of how the land became acquired by the company proprietors, it looks like it was down to one Benjamin Graysbrook. Now, he was the company surveyor for the Stroudwater Canal, and he managed to purchase 2 plots of land here at Eastington for 120 guineas. However, things get a little bit more complicated after that. A gentleman called Mr. Bigland, B-I-G-L-A-N-D, actually occupied the island itself before the dry dock was constructed. So he lived there on the island before there was a dry dock, and while it was then still called Court Orchard Lock and not Dock Lock. However, he decided to let it out. He let out part of the island to a Mr. Thomas Banks for £1 and 1 shilling in 1790. Now, the dry dock itself actually opened at an angle, probably about 45 degrees. I'll include some shots of it now. So it was coming off at an angle just before the start of Dock Lock, Court Orchard Lock, whichever you prefer. So it was just to the east of the lock itself, coming off that angle and going into the dry dock facility. One of the things that was there was a building which actually housed the icebreaker, and I think I've got an old photograph of that, so I'll include that now because I found that absolutely fascinating. And the other thing that I found fascinating was the use of the dry dock by the Methodist Church. So after the dry dock was constructed, there was a building put over the top of it, and according to the sources that I've read, it actually had a turret on the top of the building with a clock, but I don't seem to be able to find a photograph of that. That would be amazing to find that. And before the Eastington Methodist Church was constructed, and they actually held services, church services, inside the dry dock itself. And I think on one occasion there were some 300 people there in the congregation listening to the preacher inside the dry dock. It must have been an incredible acoustic effect to have that facility there. But yeah, I love finding out these secrets about the Stroudwater, and I think that was a real nugget about the Eastington Methodist Church using it for that such time. Obviously before a boat had actually gone in it to be repaired or indeed built. Now, as well as the dry dock itself, there was also a carpenter that lived by the dry dock, Mr. William Beard. Now, I would imagine that he would be responsible for the repair and maintenance of the lock gates in this area. I'm not sure if it was just the 5 locks that I've previously mentioned or other locks along the Stroudwater, but this was their main facility. There was also a blacksmith forge, again for things like the hinges and the sluice gates, that sort of thing. They were all done here at Eastington. Now, how the icebreaker worked seems to be very, very rudimentary. So it was towed by its bow, and then once it was in the canal, which would then have been frozen, they would have manhandle it with another rope, which from the masthead, they rocked it to and fro. So you got the boat moving like that to break up the ice. There was no kind of blades or anything powered through. It was actually all just done through sheer manpower to smash the ice up to enable the Severn Trowes to get through towards Wallbridge and back down to the River Severn. Now, I mentioned earlier in the video a gentleman called Mr. Hicks. It was he that ran the 3 main mills in Eastington. And because of that, and because of the importance of the coal to get into those mills, he actually managed the coal wharf here as well. Later on that was taken over by a gentleman called Samuel Critchley. The other interesting thing was that there was a canal house in the dry dock complex here, and at one time they had a committee meeting. During that committee meeting they decided to build a new property alongside Pike Lock, just the other side of the road that leads into the village of Eastington. Pike Bridge there as well. And at that point then, the lockkeeper then moved off the island and onto Pike Lock House itself. Now, something I've not been able to entirely clearly establish is whether that the canal house referred to in the minutes of the meetings and the archives is the one and the same building behind me, Dock Lock House. Was that the canal building? I'm not sure. I've gone through Joan Tucker's book and had a look at the Stroudwater archives, but I can't make a clear distinction. If you do know, please drop a comment below. Thank you. Now, just before I wrap up the Secrets of the Stroudwater episode number 6 here on West Country Wanderings, if you're not that familiar with the channel, well, I cover lots of things. But if you're primarily interested in canals, you'll find all my canal videos in my canal playlist. There you'll find all of the Secrets of Thames and Severn series and the Stroudwater series, also my regular updates. Another one of those will be coming in the next couple of months as work here progresses. I've also covered other canals as well. I've had a first look at the Somerset Coal Canal. I'm waiting for the ground to dry up again to have a look down there. And I've also covered parts of the Grand Western Canal in Devon, as well as other ones looking at the Leominster Canal and the Worcester-Birmingham Canal, amongst much else besides. So have a look at the playlist. I also run a Facebook group called West Country Wanderings, and there I do regular updates about some of the behind the scenes things that's happening on the channel, and photographs, lots of other bits and pieces. But not only that, if you join that group, the West Country Wanderings, you can share your own photographs of people and places of interest around the wider West Country. It doesn't have to be about canals, it can also be about the landscape, the nature, the history that makes up this fantastic region here in the southwest of England. Hope you enjoyed it today. Hope to see you again very soon. All the best for now. Bye bye.